views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
Thank you, Mr. Del Greco. I appreciate this opportunity immensely. We have some agencies with us today that do enforcement, and after I finish my remarks, we'll have a Q&A, and they'll have an opportunity to respond to your questions, and when we wrap up, you can mug them outside and really give them the third degree on why and how they issue summonses and how to avoid getting summonses, which is basically follow the rules, which is easier to say than do because many of these rules are very obscure for most folks. I want to start by saying something that I used to mention before, almost in passing, but I want to be really emphatic because in the last couple of weeks we've had some situations where apparently didn't sink into some folks, which is a really simple thing that's easy to say but not so easy in practice, which is if somebody gets a summons, whether it's summons returnable at oath or somewhere else, do not ignore it. If you ignore it, maybe nothing will happen. Maybe nothing will happen for a couple of years, but more often than not, sooner or later, it's going to pop up and give you some grief. I'm saying that because there's one particular organization in Queens that got summonses like 6 years ago, and they ignored it, and then they got a payment plan, and they ignored it, and then they took an amnesty thing, and they ignored it. And then they got another payment plan, and they ignored it, and they're going nuts. And something that originally was like a $500 fine if they were guilty, assuming they were guilty, has now grown to something like $3,500. And in some cases, some simple stuff sometimes grows exponentially into like $25,000, which could have been taken care of, either by going to a hearing and getting it dismissed, or paying the thing. It would have been a lot easier with a lot of less grief, and you wouldn't have creditors or marshals or whatever bugging you, 8 years down the line. We were here last year, so basically I want to give you an update on what thrilling and exciting stuff is going on in adjudications, and please stay awake. We've been reforming the way that the city handles administrative summonses over the last 2 years. And we've implemented a lot of stuff, and in the process we have learned there are bumps along the road. Some unexpected bumps, and some we knew that it was going to take a while. The obvious stuff that we knew was going to take a while had to do with IT stuff, computer stuff. I think, as I mentioned last year, there are 10 city computer systems that feed 4 different computer systems at oath, which causes a lot of issues and aggravation and some crazy processes. We're pretty well along the line in integrating oath systems. I'm told by IT that by the end of this year, actually the end of November, I expect that means by the end of March, our internal systems will be working in harmony. But we still have 10 separate city systems that feed information to us. And that is a major project that we hope will be cleaned up by 2019. This runs the gamut from very sophisticated systems that exist in places like the Department of Transportation, to very primitive systems that are just paper systems in some of the other agencies, and some of them are not particularly small agencies, but they are primitive. So that slows down the process. What we have done internally for the first time is in the process of the next stage after we created a uniform procedures for handling summonses at our facilities. We are now endeavoring to let people understand what's going on when they walk in. We created, and it started a couple of months ago actually, what we call procedural justice coordinators or ombudsmen in each of our 7 locations. Their job is somebody walks in and there should be a podium, something like this, and they can walk up to them. We call it the help desk. And as happens a lot, people get a summons, they don't know what to do with it, what the mechanics are. They can walk right up to one of those procedural justice coordinators, and they will basically take them by the hand and show them the steps they have to do to deal with the summons, whether to go to a hearing, what kind of documents they need. If their type of summons, like some summonses from some agencies, like buildings, for example, where you have a remediation process that you can correct whatever it is that they alleged was wrong before the hearing, the penalty can go down to 0. Those sort of things that many people aren't even aware of. Or even if it's written on the summons that they get, it somehow doesn't register. Simple things like that. Other things we are finding out, or I'm finding out, that is a bit of a heavier lift, not for us, but for the enforcement agencies that weren't geared for this process. One of the things that the first deputy mayor wanted us to accomplish is that people could walk in at any of our facilities in any borough with a summons any day of the week, 5 days a week, and deal with it. Well, that works for certain summonses, but for other summonses, such as most buildings department summonses, for example, I happen to have buildings on my head right now. You need somebody from the agency present at the hearing. And it turns out they don't have enough personnel to do that. So we're now in a process of working with City Hall to get them the 8 more people that they need to do that. Similarly, Consumer Affairs has a similar issue. We're ready to go, but they don't have the backup to do that stuff with. By the way, a lot of people, Consumer Affairs is one of those mystery agencies, because a lot of people don't realize what it really is. They issue something like over 80 different licenses in the city of New York, which means they do enforcement on that stuff, plus some other wonderful stuff that the city council has recently dropped on them, which is very time consuming for them as far as enforcement procedures. A quick summary of what oath is, because I think a lot of you already know. Oath is an acronym that stands for Office of Administrative Trials and Hearings. It was created by Ed Koch in 1979 by executive order, and in 1988 it became a charter agency. That's when they dropped the word mayor from in front of office. Ed Koch's idea was, and which is consistent with my idea, when I was a baby lawyer in 1979, in my first year, was a rather simple, basic justice type issue, which is If somebody has an issue with a city agency, whether it's a summons or an employee gets charges and specifications, or somebody has a human rights complaint, whatever it is, that shouldn't be judged by the same agency that issued the summons or issued the complaint. It's kind of like, to me, a common sense idea that you don't want the sheriff to also be the judge and the executioner. It's to me, basic American principles going back to the 18th century. But somehow, sometimes they get a little lost along the way. A lot of what's happened in the last, I'd say, 5 years or so is what's happened is starting with Mayor Bloomberg and continued by Mayor de Blasio is following up on Ed Koch's original concept. Oath has been in existence for 35 years, but primarily what Oath dealt with was complicated, full-blown, what basically are civil trials, with lawyers on both sides, and an administrative law judge, and a full-blown trial that can last sometimes for days, on complicated things like human rights issues, law board issues, disciplinary issues, a whole spectrum of complicated things that are basically civil trials. What's happened, again, in the last few years is that they started to move matters that result from summonses into oath. And we created a hearings division to deal with summonses. And in that division, the adjudicator is a hearing officer who will listen to both sides. Previous to that, when a hearing officer was within the agency, the hearing officer was basically, in the case of at least 2 agencies, which I will not name in order to protect the guilty, acted as an inquisitor. Not that dissimilar from the Holy Inquisition, except nobody got burned at the stake. Maybe got a little singed, but not burned at the stake. And the hearing officer's job was to basically interrogate the person who got the summons as to what his defense was or what his situation is, and likewise interrogate the agency, and then turn to the respondent, that is the person who got the summons, and explain to them what they should do to be in conformity with their agency, what their agency wanted to do. That's not the model that we use. We use the model that Ed Koch had in mind and Richard Fela, who was the first chief ALJ, had in mind, which is the hearing officer sits in the middle, and the agency and the person who got the summons, who we call the respondent, sit equally in front of the hearing officer. Hearing officer is supposed to be unbiased and totally neutral, which is to say, if the agency doesn't put forth its case completely as required by the law, they're going to lose. If the respondent doesn't put forth his defenses as he has to put forth his defenses, he's going to lose. But the hearing officer is not going to pull it out from one or the other and not going to fill in the blanks for one or the other. He's going to be dead neutral like a judge in court. That has caused a little bit of distress on the part of folks that were accustomed to things being different, but that's the way it is now, and that's the way that it was envisioned, and that is the way the mayor wants it to be, and we want to institutionalize it so that at least when I retire in a few years, it continues that way and it doesn't turn into something that it shouldn't be. To make sure that that happens, we've, like I said, created various things to streamline the process of some of our facilities make that harder. For example, in the Bronx here, we share a little bit of space in an office that actually belongs to the Department of Finance, and we are in the process of getting space actually near Yankee Stadium, which is near more transportation and more space right where all that court complex is over there. In Queens, we're doubling our space and closing down an office that is pretty prehistoric. I think the Department of Buildings wants to shut the building down. Actually, it's in that bad shape. And in Brooklyn, we're in good shape, and in Manhattan, we're in good shape. We are starting to monitor how long it takes people to do a hearing, to come to a hearing and go through the process. Our goal is eventually it shouldn't take more than 30 minutes to an hour if you walk in the door and you want to deal with a summons. That is working to some extent in some cases. In some cases, it's falling through the cracks, and part of the problem has to do with having enough personnel, and the biggest problem, personnel from the enforcement agency to be present for the hearing. But we're putting a lot of pressure on them, and we're hopefully going to have the resources given to them to be present, because at the end of the exercise, the goal is, after everything falls into place and people we know have the resources, that if somebody comes in for a hearing at a particular time and we call the summons, if the agency isn't ready, we'll proceed without the agency, and we're already doing that in some cases. The flip side of that, though, is a lot of people have figured out that if they get a summons that says 8:30 in the morning, and if they walk in at 2:30 in the afternoon, we will deal with the summons anyway. And they've learned that because, unfortunately, some agencies write all their summonses returnable at 8:30 in the morning, and they only send 4 people to deal with the summons, and they have 600 summonses scheduled for 8:30 in the morning in one borough at one time. So you're sitting there until 2 o'clock in the afternoon, so you figure, okay, I'll show up at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and at least I won't waste the whole day there. Our goal is eventually, and hopefully this will be within the next 2 or 3 years, when all these systems come together, if they still come together and haven't been shot, that when an agency puts 10:30 on a summons, and if the person who got the summons isn't there by within 45 minutes after that, they'll default. We're not going to wait until the end of the day. If the agency's not there within 45 minutes and the person is there, then we'll go forward whether the agency is ready to be there or not. That's the ultimate goal. And that's what we're working towards. So, everybody on both sides, be aware of that. We have in the last year gotten things pretty far. We are now in the process of polishing up some of the things that we have instituted. That is to say, we're finding the glitches and the burrs and stuff like that and trying to clean them up. And we're looking for input from folks as to what they see that is lacking, because where I sit, I see it from one angle, but when you get a summons and you're sitting there, you see it from a different angle, which is one of the reasons we have the procedural justice coordinators, because we use them for feedback. If somebody has a problem, somebody has an issue with how something works, if they've been waiting too long, as I found out somebody the other day was waiting 8 hours because somehow they fell through the cracks. The criminal justice coordinator didn't notice that they were there. The clerk's office didn't notice they were there. The agency that issued the summons apparently didn't notice they were there. Like 4 different people didn't notice that they were there, and then they were basically there until closing time, and their case wasn't called, which really shouldn't, something shouldn't happen. We learned about it, and we're making adjustments to see that hopefully that doesn't happen again. But we got to know about it. And our attitude is not maybe an attitude that existed once upon a time, that we're the government and we don't care. You got the summons, and that's just too bad. The days that, as one agency exclaimed to us when we told them they had to have somebody present at the hearing to present the evidence against the person who got the summons, they said, well, here's the summons. That's proof that they're guilty. And it's like, you got to be kidding me, right? You know, it's like, you know, here's the indictment. The guy got arrested. He must be guilty of murder. He got arrested. No, you're entitled to a trial and a hearing, and the person is entitled to have proof that he did or didn't do what he didn't do, what is claimed. One more aside, and this I'm adding because it confuses people about certain types of summonses, which is not really an oath issue, but people have trouble sometimes wrapping their brain around why they were found guilty of something when they didn't do anything wrong. And I'm talking about situations, for example, with property type issues, sometimes sanitation issues or DEP issues, where somebody will say something like, well, that condition existed because that's the way the property was when I bought it. So it's not my fault. Or it's somebody else came along and dumped a bunch of construction garbage in my empty lot, and it's not my fault. Well, yeah, it's not your fault, but the law isn't involved in whether it's somebody's fault or not. What the law says is that somebody is responsible for maintaining that lot in a particular condition, or that property in a particular condition. And for better or for worse, it's like a marriage. You married it, you own it, together with its liabilities as well as its privileges. And if somebody gets like one of those summonses and they say, well, it's not my fault, but that's not the issue. The issue is whether or not you're the party responsible for that property and whether or not that condition existed at the time and date that the summons was issued. I tell some people if they believe that there was no garbage on their property on that date and time when they got a summons, if they have a surveillance camera, bring in the videotape and tell them and show it to the hearing officer and tell them that the place was, of course, with a timestamp. That it was clean at the time, that kind of thing. You know, so some of these laws that summonses are issued on are strict liability, what in law you call strict liability violations. Strict liability means did the condition exist or did not exist? And whether it was, quote, your fault, whether you caused it or not, is not relevant. You are the responsible party. That's the way the legislature wrote the law, and that's the way it's been interpreted by the courts as a valid interpretation for certain types of violations, and that's the way it is. So, you know, that's why they tell you keep on monitoring your property and stuff like that there. There's not much more to update on right now. I'd like to mention that we have with us today representatives from, and I'm looking at the list to make sure I don't miss anybody, Department of Sanitation, Department of Environmental Protection, which, by the way, is responsible for, among other things, noise complaints. The Fire Department, which issues a fair number of permits and licenses and is also responsible for inspecting a bunch of safety issues. We got the Department of Small Business Services here, the Human Rights Commission. You might not, most of you probably don't know why in the world you care about the Human Rights Commission, but believe it or not, there are some issues of, relating to businesses that the Human Rights Commission is required to enforce. Right? Some of it just has to do with advertising of all things. We have the ever popular Department of Consumer Affairs because they issue a zillion licenses in the city, and they're also now, starting I think last year, required to enforce sick leave regulations and laws in the city of New York, which is very interesting. And of course, the Health Department, otherwise known as the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. I like the mental hygiene part a lot lately. And I'd like to acknowledge Adele Walker Santiago, who's here from Community Board 7 somewhere. There she is. So, you know, somebody else you can gripe to. And what I'd like to do now is, if anybody's got any questions, ask questions, and I or one of the representatives from the agencies will try to answer it for you. Because this is a breakfast, and probably some of you want to go to work. What we would normally do, particularly if it's late in the evening, each agency will spend about 15 minutes explaining their mission in life. But and we might do that if you really want to. But it's already 9:45, and we'll basically see how it goes. So, has anybody got any really exciting questions?
Well, I don't know if the question is exciting or not, but I have a question. My name is Anderson. I'm a Bronx liaison for the New York City Comptroller, Scott Stringer. One of the things that we have been seeing throughout the city, specifically here in the Bronx, is the businesses are putting things out in the sidewalk, specifically those that are regarding furniture. They put it in the sidewalk, then you have a lot of residents and homeowners that complain about it. They get summonses, but it goes a day and then they go back at it again. Is that something that the office has seen? What measurements are being taken to make sure that they are successful in their business, but that they're also within standard and understanding the quality of life that may have within the residents of the neighborhood?
That's right up Sanitation Valley.
Morning. So we normally have enforcement officers patrol those areas. We do a lot of outreach in business areas as well. We partner with Consumer Affairs, Small Business Services, and some of those outreaches, and inform all these businesses of what the rules and regulations are, because we want to make sure that they are fully aware prior to us doing any enforcement. A lot of times we go in there to enforce. They take care of the problem. They remove the furniture, they bring it in. It's supposed to not be past 3 feet. A lot of times after we leave, as you stated, they put it right back out. So it's a little cat and mouse game where Some take summonses, some refuse to remove the items. They say, give me the summonses, I'll make the cost of the summonses in less than an hour. So this is a problem that is broader than agencies. This is something that will have to be looked into at a different level, maybe from a legislative perspective, with changing the law, maybe doing some stricter fines to the businesses. But from our point, we do our regular duties as approaching the business, informing them, issuing the fines, doing the outreaches in the area as per requests of community boards, elected officials, and different entities. But the businesses fail to comply a lot of times. A lot of times they do comply and they move it to within the 3 feet line, but there's a majority that fail to comply. Okay, good.
It may require legislators to come up with more creative and harsher ways to deal with people who systemically ignore the law and just take it as a cost of doing business.
I just wanted to ask, is there a way to put together some kind of panel to discuss that issue? Because that's a big issue, particularly in our community board, Fordham Road and going up the concourse. And there was one, I can't say who, there was one business owner that actually told the police, give me all the fines you have. I set $10,000 aside just for that. And they'll put the stuff right back out. So it's just a total disregard. And now we're seeing that there's also vendors coming up, popping up on the Grand Concourse in Bedford, and they have the permit, they have the license, it's an eyesore. So we're thinking now people are starting to set up tables to sell their own personal jewelry. I mean, this is gonna happen all across the concourse, from Fordham to Bedford. We're already seeing 2 pop up. And the police come back and tell me they have the permit, they have the license. And like you said, it's a legislative issue, but maybe we need to sit down and talk together about how to make that happen quickly, because it's becoming a real problem. I just want to share that from the community board's aspect.
My standing outside of that circle, it seems to me that something that should involve getting the city council members that are affected together with the enforcement agencies that are frustrated, and I know they're frustrated, as well as the community folks, and coming up with a legislative solution.
Yes.
You know, sometimes people wonder why, years later, why this crazy-looking law existed. And they forget that this crazy-looking law exists because there was a problem that doesn't exist anymore because that crazy-looking law took care of it. I often see situations where somebody sees a rule or legislation and they have no idea why it existed. And it looks dumb because it's not a problem. Well, it's not a problem because that crazy thing solved it. An example, somebody once asked me, why is it that when the TLC issues a medallion license to somebody, they require the person to prove the source of funds? That's because in 1930s, taxi medallions were used by the mob for money laundering. And that's why today, and then they started looking at where the source of the money came from. And, but simple little things like that. And of course, if you remove that requirement, some ingenious crook is going to try to use it for money laundering again. Like I said, it requires people to get together, legislators to get together, and get a little creative. But I can't do that. Yep.
In regard to a summons from the Office of Health and Mental Hygiene, does does an agency representative have to be present with that summons? Or if you go to the hearing, I mean, if you go to the hearing, does a rep have to be there from the agency?
Generally not.
Okay.
In some cases, they want somebody there. The agency wants to have somebody there, and that's usually in cases that involve a facility that takes care of children, and they want to be. It's their policy call. If they choose not to have somebody there, then the summons should be heard within the hour of the time that it was scheduled.
That was the second part of my question. It's pretty timely, and it's not an all-day deal, then?
It shouldn't be.
It
shouldn't be.
All right.
Unless you have a daycare center where they want to be in.
No. I'm assuming.
Anybody else? Yeah.
Evan Goldberg. I was just wondering, how does balance the need, like the economic need of issuing summonses versus a person's like right to be heard versus the city's interest in generating revenue for the city?
Well, as far as I'm concerned, the only purpose for a fine is to correct behavior that the legislature has deemed to be inappropriate behavior. When a government starts, or a government agency starts thinking in terms of issuing summonses for revenue purposes, you start going down a slippery slope that leads you to a situation like had occurred in Ferguson, Missouri, where that's all that they did. Or in some instances in Baltimore, where the system was plain and simple rigged purely for revenue purposes, so that their politicians could say, "Oh, we don't raise anybody's taxes, but and we're brilliant at running government like a business, because the fines pay for everything." Some people pervert the concept of running government like a business. When most people hear running government like a business, you're thinking of running it efficiently, like a business, like all of these businesses that have gone bankrupt because they're so efficient. Hopefully not. But the main function of business is to make money, obviously. The main function of government should not be to make money. It should be to govern and make sure that the infrastructure of society makes it possible for people to do business without getting shot, spindled, mutilated, scammed, robbed, etc. My view is that I do not care about revenue. In fact, I have segregated revenue out of the hearings division completely. As a courtesy, we have an office that'll take fines if somebody wants to pay a fine. So we don't wind up sending them across town to pay a fine. But after 2 months, the whole thing is transferred over to the Department of Finance because it is a city debt. It is not a debt to oath. What I'm saying is kind of more philosophical than anything else at this point. It is, in my opinion, wrong to rely on fine revenue for purposes of city's finances. And as I told a councilman at a finance hearing, once a year when the city council has its hearings on the budget, every city agency has to come in front of the council and testify as to their economic situation. And invariably, a council member would ask me at the hearing, what is oath's revenue? And I tell them with a straight face, I don't know and I don't care. It's not my concern. It's not my business. I went out and later found out what it was and went, wow. But, seriously, it is bad public policy to tie revenue to enforcement. Enforcement should be for the purposes of correcting a particular behavior that the legislature has found to be inappropriate. It should not be go and paper the neighborhood with summonses and figure that X percent will get paid without anybody asking questions. Just for informational purposes, and this is true whether it's a criminal court summons or a civil summons or anything else, the split is basically the same. About 40% of the people who get a summons just pay the summons. Like that guy who does it, it's a cost of doing business. About 30% of the people actually go to a hearing. And the remainder just ignore it and default. Of those that go to a hearing at oath, approximately 41 to 43% of the summonses are dismissed on the merits because the person put forward an adequate defense. That statistic runs wildly different depending on what agency writes a summons. Some agencies are more careful how they write the summonses, and some are less meticulous. Some agencies that don't send anybody to the hearing are less likely to win because it's easier to rebut what's on the summons. And they range from one agency that has a dismissal rate of 10%, which is very low. I'm not going to tell you who it is. And another agency has a dismissal rate of 58% of their summonses are dismissed. And how they count their revenue stuff, I don't care. But it's, in my opinion, simply wrong. And if there's anybody here from the Office of Management and Budget, you'll recognize them because their hair is going to be on fire. When I say that, it drives them nuts. Because they have to pay the bills. You know, the city council and the mayor do their policy stuff, and they have their programs and stuff, but the Office of Management and Budget, at the end of the day, are the guys that have to have the money in the bank account to write the checks for this, that, and the other thing. So their view of life is skewed. And some agencies believe that their budget depends on their revenue, which is skewed. It's a never-ending tug of war. I'll give you a quick little example. Back in the early 1990s, I was the chairman of the Tax and Limousine Commission. And Taxi and Limousine Commission is an enforcement agency, and it's a licensing agency. And I would invariably get moaning and groaning from OMB saying they wanted me to increase fines and summonses, which I didn't, because I told them I'm a licensing agency, and I will increase revenue by getting more people to become licensed, which I did, which is the way it's supposed to work. And if you're licensed, by the way, you have a stake in not breaking the rules because you lose your license if you want to operate that way. Anyway, that's just a little side of how I view the world. Not everybody views it that way. Hopefully everybody will view it that, enough people will view it that way, because if you don't, and you wind up with a government that does policing for profit, you're going to wind up with very ugly situations like you did in Missouri, Baltimore, and a few other places. And it's happening in a lot of places in this country. Anyway, anything else? That's my little rant for the day.
What if you have a building and you're not in the building yet, but yet you have, I don't know who, but it's putting garbage in front of the building, and you're getting summonses, what do you do? I mean, who can you go to, and
Well, once you own a property, or you manage a property, whether you are in the building or not, you're responsible for the maintenance of the property. So that comes to cleaning the front sidewalk, the curve, 18 inches into the street. And if you guys are generating any refuse, you have to have a private car to pick it up until you coordinate with the Department of Sanitation Collection Office for proper collection services.
thank you.
Yes?
We have a business on White Plains Road. I'm also the president of the Merchants Association around White Plains Road. I've noticed that there is a sweeper that comes along with the truck
Mechanical broom?
and a shovel.
Okay.
Has it ever been used? I'm saying this because what happens many a times along the corridor is that they pick up the garbage, some of it spills out on the street, and they just continue on.
Okay, this is for city sanitation. So you're talking about when we have a multiple dwelling situation of residential and business?
No, I'm talking about businesses. I
We
mean,
don't-
I know.
So these businesses get picked up by private sanitation companies,
Correct.
not us.
Oh, okay.
So I represent the City of New York Department of Sanitation.
Oh.
You need to complain with the Business Integrity Commission, which is the entity that regulates all the private sanitation companies,
Oh, okay.
as it will be for your purpose for
Oh.
businesses.
But within your capacity on the city level, you guys also do, I mean,
Yeah, we do residential collection, non-for-profit schools, and if that happens with us, we just call it spillage. We do have brooms and shovels, and the proper way of handling it is picking it up. If someone's not doing it accordingly, the numbers on the side of the vehicle identifies our vehicle, and you can make a 311 complaint, and it will be directed to our office, and we will make sure that person gets spoken to in the morning roll call at the district that they get dispatched from.
what about signs that are displaced along a corridor? Say, for instance, this is a taxi stand. or
New York City Department of Transportation regulates and places all the signs up throughout the city. The Department of Sanitation will enforce a rule if it pertains to us, which will be on the street cleaning side. But as far as sign placement, we don't have anything to do with that. Okay?
Thanks.
Yes, sir.
I just want to ask a question that actually piggybacks on what she was saying, because we used to work together. In the building where we actually did work, right on the corner was a store. They used to, every single night, they used to bring their garbage in front of our building, and there were labels clearly on the boxes that said it was that store. And we still got the tickets for it.
Well, did you guys ever, so in a scenario like that, folks, you have to right away communicate with someone. Either 311, so you get that complaint in, and if you do get a summons, you already have written documentation that you complain about this issue, and it's not your refuse. Then you have to reach out to the community board, make them aware. They have direct contact to our office, and whoever else is in your district, would it be a council member, assembly person, whoever you have a direct contact with, once we find out, then we'll forward it to enforcement. Enforcement has ways to investigate and see what's going on. But anything that appears in front of your property, as the commissioner mentioned before, it is your responsibility. We're not looking to find who put it there, who didn't put it there. You have to take care of it right away and see, where's it coming from? Let us know so that then we can, in turn, help you to resolve the problem. While it's there, you have to take it in or put it out for collection, or deal with the issue.
Well, they would put the boxes there after we closed, and the ticket would be there in the morning.
Exactly.
So, that's a problem.
Well, it's a very separated incident like what you're describing right now, because I can't really go in depth in it because I don't know all the specifics of what you're telling me. Usually if a business leaves refuse in front of the property, it's for the private sanitation to pick it up. So we wouldn't enforce that unless it's put out too early. Now, if we come around the next morning and it's still there, we will normally go into the business and tell the person, can you please bring it in if your company didn't pick it up? Now, if they tell us it's not ours, we explain to them that they're still responsible and they normally bring it in. So I don't really know what specifics happened there, where you was getting fines over and over, you know what I mean?
We were getting fined for the garbage being in front.
Yeah, I understand, but it was a very awkward situation.
It was.
Yeah, so.
For sure.
I live in a private house, and we have a rather strange lady on our block. Believe it or not, at 2 o'clock in the morning, she'll come out and start rearranging people's garbage. You know, like, this guy doesn't have enough garbage outside, so I'll move some over here. And I mean, no one's had a serious issue with it so far, other than that she's very, very weird. I'm sorry, but that just came to my head.
I have a question about the hearing. You said that for the most part, 40% or 41% usually get thrown out.
Yeah.
I'm a manager, and I manage like 52 properties all over the place. And what I found is usually when I get a summons, whether it be for maintenance, garbage, or whatever it is, and I rectify it before the next court date, with a certificate of correction, pictures and everything, there still seems to be a fine of like a minimum of $300 or $400. It's never really dismissed. It's always like a minimum.
Well, it wouldn't be dismissed. What it should do is mitigate whatever the maximum penalty would have been, and that's built into the penalty schedule of that particular agency. The way excuse me?
Even on first offenses?
It depends on the agency and the way they wrote the rules. The way the system works as far as the penalty structure goes, and it varies pretty wildly across the board in the administrative code, because different parts of the code were written at different times, and I don't know what sometimes they were thinking of when they came up with a plan. But some sections of the administrative code are very, very specific, that the penalty for X is Y, period. Other sections of the administrative code say the penalty for A is B unless C, in which case it's D. And
You lost me after the first one.
yeah, right. Tell me about it. We literally have charts to keep track of this stuff. And then, just to make it more complicated, some sections of the administrative code have that level of what it should be the penalties for a particular thing, and then it says the particular enforcement agency is responsible for writing the enforcement rules and for specifying what the actual penalties are within a certain range. And that is done set by the enforcement agencies. For example, up until about 12 years ago, for certain penalties, the rules, some laws said the maximum penalty for this violation is up to $10,000, right? And the enforcement agency that is responsible for creating the penalty rules would say, well, the penalty is going to be between $50 and $300 to be determined by the hearing officer based on the facts and circumstances of a particular incident. And the hearing officer would set the penalty based on what, if A, they find the person guilty, and B, the circumstances. What happened in actually the 12 years of the prior administration is that the agencies instead said the penalty will be X with no variation if the person is found guilty or pleads guilty. And if the person defaults, the penalty will be like 3 times higher automatically. We don't have control over that. Which is one of the reasons I say, by the way, never ignore a summons, because some summonses would have a penalty of, say, $300 if you're found guilty or you plead guilty. But if you ignore the summons, the penalty then becomes $1,200 if you're not there by the return date of the summons. So it varies wildly depending on the particular violation, and it varies wildly depending on the agency's enforcement philosophy. That's something we don't have control over.
I have a perfect example. I have a retail center. Next door to my retail center was an abandoned warehouse. They knocked the abandoned warehouse down to put up a building. I guess when they did that, they disturbed some burrows or something like that, and some of the rodents started going onto my property. I took pictures of the construction. I took pictures of my garbage corral. And I went to court and everything, and I still got a $300 fine. So I had the proof, I had the pictures. It's almost like, you know, they stole it on my property, so I have to pay for it, even though the construction was being done right next door on my property. So,
That basically goes to what the sanitation department was just talking about a while ago. Across the street from where my office is 100. My office is 100 Church Street. Across the street, it just opened this year, new Four Seasons Hotel, 84-story hotel. The lower floors are a regular hotel if you're a millionaire, and seriously. And the upper floors are residential. And when I say millionaire, I mean, I'm wrong, I'm talking about billionaire. Because the 5 apartments on the top each went for, I think, $87 million each. Which is a little above my budget. But I remember, I remember when the construction was going on. At night when people were leaving my building, because they would go to the subway, they have to go around with the construction, so they couldn't go around there anymore. They had to walk another block around because of the waves of rats that were basically boogieing on the sidewalk after dark. I guess that's one of the plagues of cities since the Middle Ages. But that's what happens when there's construction, in this city anyway.
so it's like unfortunate.
Yeah.
You can also appeal too. If you disagree with the hearing officer's decision, the commissioner can speak to the appeal process. So if you get a decision that you don't agree with and you submitted evidence that you think wasn't taken into consideration, there's a whole appeal process for that.
There's an important thing that she just mentioned. On an appeal, the only thing that you can appeal is that whether it's actually agencies and respondents both take appeals. And they're both just as happy when they lose. But on appeal, the only thing that we can review is what was submitted at the hearing. And number one, and number two, basically you can only appeal where the hearing officer made an error as to the rules or the law being applied to that particular alleged violation. The appeal is not a new hearing. The facts are not reviewed. In other words, you can't present new evidence that wasn't at the hearing. The findings of fact cannot be changed. But what can be changed is the conclusions that are drawn from the facts and the rules and law taken together. And in fact, we are in the process right now of creating a new appeals process that is closer to the appeals process that you would find in court. Right now, the process is, I'm oversimplifying it, but an appeal would go before 3 people who review it and make a determination based on the submissions made on paper, claiming what was wrong with the decision. We're looking to create a process that is not only more efficient, but will also allow for certain circumstances where the person making the appeal can actually personally present orally what their arguments are. But that's a couple of years down the line, because a lot of laws have to be changed in order for us to do that.
I work with Robert also, so we do have a lot of properties, and you keep mentioning about don't let a summons just sit there and default.
Mm-hmm.
We have a lot of problems trying to kind of track down our properties having summonses,
Mm-hmm.
and more particularly with FDNY, because we can go to the building information system, type in our block and lot, and we can find out ECB, DOB violations. However, for FDNY, we don't really know if there's any online mechanism and with oath, by the time we find out, we have to go to court. We can't really, that's when we may be able to finally get the ticket information, but you have to remember, we also have commercial properties, so sometimes our tenants don't, if they see something come in, it's not like they're going to hold on to this piece of information, give it to Bobby, give it to me. So right now with FDNY, you mentioned technological advances. Are they going to have something online where you can, type in a block and lot and find out the same information like the DOB?
I'm not sure what their plans are right now, and I'll defer to FDNY. But before that, there is something called the Open Data Portal in the city of New York where you can call raw data. And a lot of that has to do with summonses, and a lot of reps use that to find out who's got summonses and who doesn't yet. Even oath, for example, we may not know a summons is issued until almost a month after it's issued, which causes us some complications as well. Sometimes a summons is issued and it's floating around in the agency, and it has to be answered in 30 days, and we only get the summons like 3 days before the hearing, which drives us crazy, which is one reason why if you got a summons like that, say a sanitation summons or whatever, and we don't have it in our system yet, if you show up with your paper copy of the summons and you wanted it adjudicated, we will adjudicate it, and we will hold it until we get the official filing from the agency. And then we'll apply whatever the decision is. And if we don't get it from the agency, we'll dismiss it within, I forgot what the number was.
So it's an in-person, go down, that's pending we get an actual paper violation?
Yeah. I'll let the fire department answer what their IT plans are for the future.
Okay, I'm not in the IT department, so I can't speak to the timeline, but we're in the process of generating that same thing the
Because we're
Department of
willing
Buildings
to
has.
deal with them, we just have to know we have them.
Well,
And
if you have the summons number, you make the phone call, we can help you out. But like I said, we're in the process of getting on board with this
If
technology.
she gives an address, could you guys figure out whether a summons was issued?
We can, but it's a lot easier if you have the summons number. But we can do a search based on your
block
address.
and lot, things like that.
By the way, the block and lot thing doesn't work in certain parts of the city, certain parts of Queens and Staten Island. For example, there's a section of Queens called Breezy Point where one block and lot may have as many as 20 or 40 houses, which is crazy. But that's legacy stuff from like 2 centuries ago. Anything else? Yeah.
With regards to like an appeal, what would be like the cost benefit of filing an appeal? Like say you're fined $300, you're found guilty. Is it better just to pay the fine or to take it a step further and like burn another day of work to go through the entire appellate process?
Well, right now, the appeals process is on paper. So it's basically you fill out a form and put your information on it and you submit it, and that's all you got to do. You don't have to go in person. You can do it by online.
But with the three ALJs that you were talking about earlier, wouldn't that just make it more costly?
You mean for the agency?
No, for the consumer.
Doesn't cost the consumer anything. They don't pay for the hearing officers.
Oh, no. But they have to take it, they have to leave work to go to the hearing.
No, there isn't a hearing.
Okay.
It's all on paper.
Okay.
It's all on paper.
Even
What we envision that in the future, a particularly complicated type thing, you may want to you will be asked to explain in person what your arguments are. But I'm talking about really something esoteric. Like we deal with cases from the campaign finance board, and those could get complicated. Accounting questions and stuff like that. That's pretty different from your basic dirty sidewalk summons, which is either it is or it isn't, that kind of thing. Yes, sir.
Commissioner, I'm just curious. A homeowner gets a summons and goes through a hearing and then eventually found guilty and is fired. Does that amount somewhere on the road to a judgment against the homeowner?
It can if it isn't paid. What happens is if, and again, it depends on the summons and the agency because of the way the administrative code is written. But basically, if it's certain summonses, if they're not paid within 90 days, then it's docketed as a civil court judgment and it goes to the Department of Finance for collection. The Department of Finance this year started a program and my guess is they're going to change the levels at some point. But if somebody owed the city at least $7,000, they did this as a pilot project, they will issue an execution on that judgment and give it to the marshal for collection. The marshal's office will then move to physically collect, either by, if it's garnishing wages or attaching bank accounts, or actually going to the business and taking an inventory of property in the business and seizing it and selling it at auction to recover the money. Right now, their threshold for that pilot project is $7,000. Where it's going to go in the future, I don't know. But there's about $1.5 billion in fines that the city hasn't collected going back about 30 years, 30, 35 years. Some of them are stuff that's uncollectible because before Oath was reviewing this stuff, some of these summonses are it's blank where it says who the respondent is. So you don't know who the heck it is. And some people are dead, and some people no longer own that property. But those weird things aside, it does become a judgment. It is recorded, and it's enforceable by execution. Execution, by the way, is when a lawyer for the judgment creditor, in this case the Department of Finance, signs a document called an execution and gives it either to the sheriff or to the city marshal. They then are now authorized to go and grab the money wherever they can, find it. That's what I mean by execution. It's not, nobody's gonna get shot or hung or electrocuted. Yeah. Those were the good old days. But as I was saying, it becomes an executable judgment for 8 years. The city keeps it on the books basically forever because it's still a valid debt, but they can't execute it unless it's been extended by some quirk in the law for that individual. I know, for example, TLC keeps it on the books forever because if you decide you want a license from the city of New York, 12 years from now, they're going to look it up and say, wait a minute, you still owe the city of New York $300 and we're not going to issue you the license until you pay that $300 to us. Thank you very much. So it looks more inflated than it really is for those reasons. Short answer to your question is, yes, it can become a judgment. And if a credit reporting agency does their research, it'll pop up. But it won't be a judgment if you pay it within 90 days. Yes, sir.
Commissioner, my name is Mike Tatch. I would like to explore a little bit more your statement about mitigating penalties by showing abatement.
Mm-hmm.
What agencies give you some room on that?
The buildings department does, I believe the health department, I think the fire department. And I think perhaps in some instances consumer affairs. It depends on the category.
Thank you.
And then those agencies can give you the details as to what
Sorry?
those agencies can give you the details as to what those are.
Can I?
Yeah,
can I
please.
consumer-
You want a copy?
Yeah, sure. So, my name's Steve. I'm from Consumer Affairs. Just to follow up on your question, at our table right out there and also on our website is a frequently asked questions list for all curable violations. It gives you a list of those violations. So basically within 30 days, based on I believe, 2013 law that the council passed, if you show corrective action within 30 days, there's no fine. There's also a settlement frequently asked questions sheet that's on our table there, also available online, that will allow you to settle, which obviously will, in some instances, mitigate the amount of fine that you would get. And your ability to cure or settle a violation is determined on what the actual summons you receive is, and that you usually get a letter from our agency within 1 or 2 weeks from the issuance of the summons. So I'm happy to talk to you offline about that, and all that information is on our table.
I just want to add that many agencies have a settlement process where you can contact the agency and try to settle the issue before it comes to a hearing. Also, if something does wind up in judgment, that is in the Department of Finance's turf, and the Department of Finance also has the power to come to a settlement agreement on perhaps a reduced amount based on the dollar for a particular case. So, that's something that, particularly if you have a significant fine, it is worth considering approaching DOF, Department of Finance's legal people, and asking if you can come to some kind of a settlement or payment plan or something like that. I'm sorry, you?
Oh, you just want to mention Bruce McDonald, DP. We have a few of our own, a couple in noise, and a very sort of minor one in boilers, and also for not doing your annual backflow test. You can get it from $500 to $50 if you do the test and come into the hearing with them. We had one gentleman who was a little hitch, but
Right.
it will be reduced to $50.
Yeah, 2 of them.
Yeah, 2 of them. So I just wanted to mention that. Thank you. If we have a table, feel free to stop by if you want more information.
Yeah, there's a lot more detail out there. Anything else? I thank you for coming. I very much appreciate it.